Hello everyone, today I will recap the movie 12 Strong. The movie tells the story of a U.S. Army Special Forces team led by Captain Mitch Nelson, who were sent to Afghanistan right after the September 11th attacks. While the terrorists had up to 50,000 fighters, his team had only 12 men. Not to mention the terrorists were equipped with heavy weapons. So how did this battle unfold? Let's watch today's recap. On September 11th, 2001, the Twin Towers in the United States were attacked by terrorists, killing nearly 3,000 people and injuring more than 10,000. On October 7th of the same year, the United States began military operations against the Taliban. This elite team consisted of 12 members of the Green Berets, who are also the main characters of this movie. The Green Berets are a special operations unit of the U.S. Army, specializing in reconnaissance and intelligence missions. At that time, Captain Mitch Nelson was on family leave. He asked his commander for permission to assemble a team to fight the terrorists. However, the commander believed Nelson was too young for such a mission. Fortunately, the deputy officer, who had many years of experience, advised the commander that Nelson was a talented young man. He also said that with proper leadership, Nelson would be able to complete the mission successfully. After hearing this, the commander agreed and allowed their team to move forward. On October 16th, the 12 soldiers arrived at a military base near the Afghan border. Many other teams were also waiting there for orders, preparing to act as the first line of attack against terrorist groups. They needed to convince the base commander of their plan. Although bin Laden had carried out the attacks on the United States, the real power behind him was the Taliban. If they could destroy the Taliban's strength, future attacks could be prevented. Nelson believed that capturing the city of Mazar would weaken both bin Laden and the Taliban. However, the commander explained that this was only partly true. He stated that capturing the city was not their direct responsibility. That task belonged to General Dostum, the Afghan leader of the Northern Alliance forces. However, although General Dostum was an enemy of the Taliban, his army was much weaker. Therefore, the mission of the 12 Special Forces soldiers was to build trust with General Dostum. They had to join his forces and work together to defeat the Taliban. Nelson confidently said that he could complete the mission in 3 weeks, but the commander disagreed and said it was nearly impossible. Nelson explained that heavy snow in November would block the routes. If they failed to capture Mazar before then, returning safely would become extremely difficult. After accepting the mission, Nelson briefed his team on the situation. General Dostum commanded a force of around 200 men along with several militia groups. Meanwhile, their enemy was a massive terrorist force of more than 50,000 fighters equipped with modern weapons. The team members joked that it felt like 1 against 5,000, with enemies everywhere and no fear of hitting their own teammates. However, the joke was not enough to ease the tension among the rest of the team. One of the soldiers asked Nelson if their flight route had been properly tested. The team leader replied that they themselves would be testing it once they boarded the plane. They were shocked to learn that their aircraft could only reach an altitude of 3,000 meters. The team questioned how this was possible, since the mountains they had to cross were higher than 3,000 meters. They also worried that sandstorms and enemy missiles could destroy their aircraft. Because of this, they believed the plane should fly at least above 6,000 meters. Nelson then clarified that the actual flying altitude would be 7,620 meters. Even so, he remained concerned about whether the team would have enough oxygen at that height. The pilot admitted that he had tested flying at that altitude before. However, during the test, the co-pilot experienced hallucinations. He even thought he saw extra oxygen masks, but they were not real. Soon, the 3 aircraft took off toward their target. During the flight, a powerful sandstorm suddenly appeared. Some of the soldiers could not handle it and began to vomit. Despite these challenges, they managed to reach the designated drop point. Nelson ordered everyone to put on their night vision goggles, prepare for an ambush, and wait for contact from their informant. Ahead of them, they spotted 2 heavily armed men. This made them suspect that the men were not allies. As the 2 approached, the team prepared to attack. But suddenly, a large group of armed men appeared. To their surprise, the group greeted them warmly and claimed to be allies. It turned out to be a misunderstanding. After meeting the informant, he guided them across several mountains to a militia-controlled area. Although they shared a common enemy, there was little trust between them. The militia did not show much sympathy toward the American team. The informant explained that the Northern Alliance had broken into 3 separate militia groups. General Dostum's group was one of them, but the groups did not get along. Sometimes, instead of fighting the Taliban, they would end up fighting each other. The informant also warned Nelson to stay alert, as the Taliban had placed a high bounty on their heads. On the second day, the sound of gunfire echoed continuously. The team quickly prepared for battle, but when they stepped outside, they realized it was General Dostum patrolling on horseback. The gunfire was simply their way of greeting. Despite having limited ammunition, the fighters still showed great spirit. General Dostum did not warmly welcome their arrival. He mistakenly thought the deputy officer was the commander. He hugged him and then led him inside, still unaware of the mistake. At this point, both sides sat around the table, and the atmosphere became tense and uncomfortable. Everyone kept their weapons ready, staying alert. Captain Nelson took out a bottle of wine he had prepared as a gesture to approach General Dostum. Seeing how young and inexperienced Nelson looked, Dostum questioned why someone so young was speaking on behalf of the team. Suddenly, both sides raised their guns and aimed at each other. Thanks to quick intervention and calm words, the situation was temporarily diffused. Dostum then asked Nelson why his men looked like trained killers, while he himself seemed inexperienced. Nelson responded confidently that if Dostum wanted proof, he should take him to the Taliban and he would show his capability. Dostum decided to test the young captain and see how he managed to lead 11 highly trained soldiers. Soon after, another strange situation arose. The Taliban had modern tanks, yet this general still relied on horses for movement. It seemed unbelievable. Out of the 12 men, there were only 6 horses available. Because of this, Nelson had to divide his team into 2 groups for reconnaissance. Dostum, being cautious, kept some of the soldiers with him as a guarantee, fearing they might be spies. Meanwhile, in a nearby village, a Taliban leader had captured several civilians, including 3 children. He pretended to comfort them and asked one child which animal had the longest neck. The frightened child answered, "Giraffe." The leader then asked how to spell it in English, and the child answered correctly. He praised the child for the answer. Next, he asked another child to solve a simple math question. The child was too scared to respond, but a third child answered correctly. The leader praised her, but then suddenly turned violent. He removed the headscarf of a teacher who was kneeling nearby and shot her. The militants around him celebrated. He had enforced a rule that girls above the age of 8 were not allowed to attend school. At the same time, General Dostum guided Nelson through the mountains. By afternoon, they reached a place called Kabachi Cave. The high terrain disrupted their communication equipment. The team began to worry that the general might be misleading them. Later, Dostum came out and announced that they would launch an attack on the Taliban the next day. The following morning, they reached a village occupied by the Taliban, about 45 kilometers south of Mazar. After observing the area from a distance, Dostum told Nelson to call for an airstrike. Nelson believed they were too far away for an accurate strike. However, Dostum feared that if they moved closer and an American soldier was killed, the United States might withdraw support. If that happened, his forces would be defeated. With no other option, Nelson agreed. He immediately sent the coordinates to the base. The fighter jets, already on standby, quickly moved in and dropped bombs on the target. Dostum's men began celebrating when they saw the bombs explode. However, Nelson was too far from the target, and the coordinates were incorrect. As a result, the bombs missed the enemy completely. Frustrated, Nelson refused to argue further and decided to move closer to get accurate coordinates. Dostum, concerned for his safety, sent a man to support him while they prepared to report the location again. Suddenly, the terrorist group launched an attack. Fortunately, Nelson had taken cover behind a large rock. The enemy fighters were heavily armed and ready for combat. After careful effort, the team finally identified the exact position of the enemy. The bombers returned, and this time the coordinates were correct. The strike hit the target successfully, causing heavy losses to the Taliban. Nelson wanted to push forward and capture the next base. However, Dostum refused to continue. The next village had once belonged to him, and his relatives still lived there. After seeing the destructive power of the airstrikes, he hoped his family could escape safely. Around this time, a supply drop was sent for the team. However, local villagers took the supplies and later sold them back to the soldiers. Meanwhile, a young boy kept following Ben everywhere, even disturbing him at uncomfortable moments. Ben felt uneasy and reported the situation to the deputy officer. Using his experience, the deputy explained that if any American soldier was killed, Dostum would punish the person he believed responsible, along with their entire family. Hearing this, Ben felt sympathy for the boy. He took out a lollipop and gave it to him as a gesture of kindness. In that region, such a treat was considered a rare luxury. The U.S. command later considered the mission unsuccessful, so they planned to send another team to negotiate with a different warlord the next morning. At dawn, Nelson and Dostum gathered with their men on a mountain. The same boy greeted Nelson respectfully, and Nelson smiled back. Nelson asked why they were still using horses, since explosions could scare them. Dostum replied that the horses were used to these sounds and would not panic. Nelson found this hard to believe but said nothing further. Soon, they used firepower to trigger another explosion. The blast caused panic among the Taliban fighters, forcing them to retreat. Taking advantage of the confusion, Dostum ordered a full attack. Some Taliban fighters dropped their weapons and surrendered. However, Dostum showed no mercy and had them executed. He then sent his soldiers and cavalry into the village to eliminate the remaining fighters. From the mountain, Nelson noticed that the enemy had tanks supporting them. He quickly called for air support, but he was informed that no aircraft were available to assist. Realizing the danger, the special forces rushed down the mountain. They moved quickly to stop Dostum's forces from walking into a deadly trap. Thanks to Nelson's quick decision, Dostum narrowly avoided a disastrous outcome. Nelson saw the body of the young boy who had greeted him earlier. There was no time to grieve, so the team quickly retreated. Even so, Dostum lost several of his men by evening. Dostum explained that the Taliban transported weapons through the Tangi Pass, the only route into the city of Mazar. He knew about their supply route, but had not expected their strength that night. Nelson contacted his deputy and ordered the entire team to regroup for the next attack. The deputy, being older, struggled with riding horses, which concerned Dostum. By the third day, Dostum began to doubt their readiness. Despite this, Nelson organized another assault. The enemy fighters were highly strategic, hiding quietly and preparing to ambush from concealed positions. They avoided making any noise, making it difficult to detect them. Nelson was unaware of the danger approaching. Although the deputy observing from above noticed the threat, the warning came too late. The team was caught off guard. Nelson narrowly escaped and took cover behind a wall before returning fire. Dostum charged forward aggressively, not wanting to miss the opportunity. Nelson realized he could not retreat and ordered his team to continue supporting the attack. During the intense firefight, Nelson threw a grenade toward the enemy. Despite the pressure, the enemy refused to surrender. With sniper support from above, Dostum's forces continued pushing forward. Meanwhile, armed only with an M4 rifle, Nelson fought through heavy gunfire. He then grabbed an anti-tank weapon and fired directly at the enemy positions. This created an opening for the team to safely withdraw from the most dangerous area. In the end, they successfully captured the village. Afterward, Nelson joked with Dostum, saying that staying too close to him might get him killed. Dostum reflected on the past, recalling when he once controlled the region and the children had proper education and enough food. Their next objective was the enemy headquarters. However, to reach it, they had to pass through a narrow mountain path that was highly vulnerable to ambush. By the 16th day, they had destroyed several enemy outposts along the Tangi Pass. The road to Mazar was now within reach. At that moment, the deputy informed Nelson that another special forces team had made contact with General Atta, one of Dostum's rivals. They were heading toward his territory. When Nelson reported this to Dostum, he became furious. He did not want to be used as a pawn in someone else's power struggle. As a result, he decided to end the partnership and leave. Now, the 12 Special Forces soldiers had to rely entirely on themselves to complete the mission. If they failed, the threat of further attacks would remain. The team leader divided the soldiers into smaller groups and positioned them in a canyon for an ambush. While moving toward an observation point, Nelson and another soldier were suddenly spotted by an enemy fighter. Luckily, a sniper on the southern flank spotted the scout. He adjusted his aim slightly to the left and fired a precise shot, eliminating the enemy. At the same time, Charlie's squad on the northern flank arrived and set up a radio station to communicate with the bombers. With everyone in position, a 1 against thousands battle was about to begin. Most of the Taliban's elite forces were gathered inside the canyon. The team leader ordered a laser scan to identify enemy positions and send accurate coordinates to the aircraft. The Air Force began continuous bombing, turning the canyon into a deadly zone. After the first wave, the Special Forces observers continued searching for targets. Suddenly, a group of enemy fighters appeared in front of the deputy commander. Some of them raised white flags. The soldiers could not tell whether they intended to surrender or attack. They repeatedly warned them to stop and not move forward. Since both sides spoke different languages, communication failed. The tension kept rising as the group moved closer. The number of enemies increased, making it seem like they were about to surround them. However, when the enemy did not act immediately, the soldiers became less alert. At that moment, one of the attackers detonated an explosive strapped to his body. Several Special Forces members were injured in the blast. When they regained awareness, they saw that the deputy commander was critically wounded. The team quickly called for evacuation and carried him back to their observation post. Their position had likely been exposed, as both the southern and northern flanks came under heavy fire. The communication antennas were destroyed during the attack. One brave soldier ran through the battlefield to recover the equipment. While doing so, he spotted a Soviet 122mm multiple rocket launcher in use by the enemy. After some effort, communication with the bombers was restored. At this critical moment, Dostum returned with his forces to support Nelson. However, Nelson's position came under intense artillery fire, with dozens of rounds hitting the area. The damage was severe. If the artillery was not destroyed, the enemy leader could escape easily. Nelson decided to attack during the enemy's reload time. Despite pushing forward aggressively, the enemy forces were overwhelming in number. Their bullets seemed to have little effect against such a large force. Meanwhile, the enemy leader ordered his men to reload the artillery, confident in their advantage. The team team felt the pressure and requested air support again. However, the target was too close, and an airstrike could harm their own soldiers. Nelson realized that the artillery could only fire a limited number of rounds before needing to reload. That short window was their only chance to strike. As the situation became critical, Nelson made a bold decision. He led a direct charge toward the enemy. The rest of the team followed him into the battle. They knew the risk of heavy casualties, but they only had a couple of minutes to act. Seizing the moment, Nelson rode forward into intense enemy fire. His teammates and allied fighters charged behind him. They pushed ahead without fear, determined to break through and destroy the enemy forces. One of the team members saw an enemy vehicle rushing toward him and fired a shot, causing it to flip over. At that moment, the cannon was reloaded and began firing again. However, due to the close distance, it was not effective and soon ran out of ammunition. Just as Nelson ordered his team to destroy the cannon, an explosion struck nearby and knocked him to the ground, leaving him disoriented. The enemy attempted a surprise attack, but it failed as the team fought back immediately. Now, the Taliban forces had no way to retreat. Dostum had already pushed deep into the area with his troops. The enemy quickly moved a tank forward to block their path, slowing the militia's advance. However, they underestimated Nelson. With precise shots, he eliminated the enemy operating the mortar. The team quickly moved closer to the enemy weapons. A suicide attacker threw a grenade, but Nelson narrowly avoided it. Realizing the situation was collapsing, the Taliban leader attempted to escape. While fleeing, he accidentally drove into his own defensive position, and his vehicle got stuck. Soon after, he was killed during the chaos. Dostum and Nelson declared a major victory. Nelson then spoke with his injured deputy about returning home. The deputy was quickly evacuated by helicopter for medical treatment. However, the conflict was not completely over. Another general had already reached Mazar City earlier. Dostum went to meet him to resolve the situation. Many expected a violent confrontation, but instead, the outcome was peaceful. Dostum chose to shake hands with his rival and handed over control of the city. Nelson praised him for making a wise decision. Dostum responded that in war, there is no perfect choice. He said that Afghanistan has been the graveyard of many powerful empires. Today's allies can become tomorrow's enemies. He warned that one day the United States could also face the same fate. He added that leaving might seem like weakness, but staying could turn friends into enemies. Still, he told them they would always be considered brothers. This is where the story comes to an end. These 12 Special Forces soldiers represent determination and resilience in the face of extreme challenges. During the mission, they endured harsh conditions and constant danger before finally returning safely. Many experts believe such operations usually take years to complete. However, this mission was accomplished in just a few weeks with remarkable success.